Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is the New York Times by the book tag. It's an old tag that's been around for a long time but has been sort of dusted off and resurrected this year recently, and I was tagged by Courtney Ferreter, so thank you Courtney for the tag, and I shall post the link to her take on the tag below. Prompt 1. What book is on your nightstand now? So before I show you the books, quick question to British viewers. We call it a bedside table, don't we? Or do we use the word nightstand? I always associate nightstand with being an American term, but let me know. So I have two books. I have Thomas Bernhard's Correction, which I have 60 pages to go, and it's very dense. I'm enjoying it though, but I have to take it in small chunks because it's stream of consciousness, run-on sentences, lots of repetition, all of which I like, because to me that far more represents how we humans think than most literary treatments of human thought processes. But as I say, I can only do it in short bursts. And this is my final Read More German Lit of 2020. It's my 15th title, and I shall be doing a review video of that. The other is this, Whatever Happened to Harold Absalon by Simon Okotie, which I started a couple of hours ago. Never heard of the author until Twitter provided me with the prompt somehow. It doesn't happen very often. Someone had posted asking for recommendations of books that take place over a very short space of time, such as a day or an afternoon or whatever. So you had the first two books by Nicholson Baker, including The Mezzanine. You had a couple of B.S. Johnson books, The Unfortunates and House Mother Normal, and lots of other books. Someone suggested this, and it sounded intriguing. It's a sort of metaphysical detective novel, and I've only read 20 pages, but it's very, very much the Nicholson Baker style of writing, of that sort of minute dissection of detail. Now, in The Mezzanine, that's a story set in an office. It basically takes place over the course of a lift journey down to lunch, for someone's lunch break. Because this is a detective, it makes sense to have that sort of microscopic level of detail, trying to forge associations and sort of bringing things together as clues and stuff. So, yeah, let's see where this gets to. 2. What was the last truly great book you read? Well, none this year. I have read lots of 5-star books, but none of them have been near as damn it perfect. They've all had flaws in them. So I don't have one for this year. So I have to go back to last year's book of the year, which was the inestimable Lost Children Archive by Valeria Luiselli, which is a near as damn it perfect book. I shall post a link to my full review of it below. 3. If you could meet any writer, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you want to know? Well, it would be Samuel Beckett, and I have several questions for Samuel Beckett. The first is assuming that he could report on what it was like being dead, because I think Beckett is one of the authors who tried to deal with it, sort of the existential crises of death in his work. And if he was in a position to report back on what the afterlife actually amounted to, that would be useful. But if he couldn't specifically, I would talk to him first of all about theatre, because no one is as theatrical a writer in his stage plays as Samuel Beckett, which sounds weird because obviously they're stage plays, of course they're going to be theatrical. But the life of his characters, or how he sees those characters, such as in Endgame or in Waiting for Godot, human life as theatre is theatre. And in Endgame, the 4 characters are in a room with which is sort of just basically an empty black box, 2 tiny windows through which they can't see anything outside, which is a sort of meta reflection of what the theatre audience are. They are in a blacked out box, darkened box, no windows. The only source of light for them is the lit stage. So he's a supreme understander and appreciator of theatre as theatre, but also life as theatre. Not theatrical, not sort of dramatic and acting and projecting, but the metaphors and symbols of theatre Beckett absolutely got. And then the other thing I'd like to ask him is, Beckett, basically his writing is, again, existentialist, quite, nihilist in many ways, sort of he saw life as gloomy, doomy, absurd, meaningless. And I'd just like to ask him, you know, because he himself lived quite a jolly life. I'm not saying he didn't have periods of depression, because he did, but, you know, he liked to drink and he liked to sing songs around the piano. He was big into his sports. So just how does he reconcile his personal take on life with what he wrote? 4. What books might we be surprised to find on your shelves? Well, there's a couple, and I think they're sort of quite divergent from each other. So the first is Job's Body by Dean Juhan, a handbook for bodywork. So this is an anatomy book of sorts, lots of diagrams and photos. But it's not one a medical student would use, because this comes from the alternative medicine world, sort of shiatsu, massage, reiki, kinesiology, reflexology, all that sort of stuff. And I read it to get to merge the grounding in anatomy that I think any sort of fiction writer needs, but also coming from an alternative health point of view, which is something I was interested in anyway. And indeed, there's a couple of lines early on in here which the launching pad for my novel 3 Dreams in the Key of G. So I poured through the 350 pages of this with relative anatomical ignorance, which I still have to a large extent. But I got a lot out of it, and I keep this handy. I keep this as a reference book. And the other is Women Talking by Miriam Tees, a book about a Mennonite community, Mennonites being like the Amish, being sort of, 200-300 years behind the times in terms of lifestyle and technology, and it's basically a theological debate as to how to apply it to their lives. So both of those, you would think that doesn't sound like a Mark book, but it's a work of genius, I think, because a group of Mennonite women have all been sexually assaulted while drugged by some of the menfolk in their community, and the menfolk are being banged up in the local jail while the accusations are being investigated. And the women have come together to discuss what their response should be, what their course of action should be. Now, these women are not educated, they're illiterate, they're not used to having the freedom to meet and discuss like this. This is very much like a sort of a transgressive act in and of itself. But the genius of the book is all they have recourse to make their arguments is the Bible, because obviously they're well boned up on that, because they go to chapel, church, whatever, all the time, and it's drubbed into them. But the interesting thing is that there are those who have a very literal interpretation of the Bible, and there are those who have a much more sort of metaphorical, symbolic, open-ended interpretation, which makes their abilities to agree with each other quite difficult, because their thinking processes are almost sort of so divergent. And it's a brilliant, that doesn't just apply to sort of Bible exegesis. That applies to all communication, all writing. Did the speaker mean that literally, or were they using metaphor by way of illustration? And, this is terrific. 5. How do you organise your personal library? Okay, well, I have limited space in the house. I only have 2 bookcases in the house. So most of my collection is housed in the shed outside, which is a sort of literary purdah of all the books that I don't see a need to keep close to hand, because I won't ever pick them up again, or are unlikely to, except to show in a tag video. Because it's too cold and wet in the winter to go out there. So, I really must not need books that are out there. And inside, so the 2 bookcases, 5 shelves each. The top shelf of bookcase 1 is non-fiction, all the key reference books I need on many different subjects. Then I have 2 shelves of American authors, one being more postmodern and avant-garde and experimental than the other. Then I have 2 shelves of British authors. I'm slightly hesitant to say one, like the American, is sort of more experimental and avant-garde than the other, because there's not much experimentalism amongst British authors. But there is, in my mind, there's a qualitative difference between the type of British writers on shelf 4 and shelf 5. And then my other bookcase, the first two shelves are women writers, then it's European writers, then it's rest of the world writers. And yes, what happens if a woman writer could fit in rest of the world or Europe? Good question. Tends to be determined by what space I have available on the shelf. And the final shelf is another shelf of British authors. And then I have this sort of, it's like a sort of a freestanding on stilts thing, which is supposed to sort of, sit on a desk because it's a stationery and papers compartment thing. But over the years, I've had to change desks so many times. The current desk is not the right dimensions for this thing. So that just sits on the floor behind my desk. And the open-ended, it doesn't have a ceiling shelf, currently is occupied by my son's books. And when he leaves home, I will take my non-fiction and put that on the shelf, which will also free up another shelf in my bookcase. And then there's a sort of, as I say, a sort of stationery compartment or whatever, in which I have some more non-fiction. And then in the gap underneath, where the stilts are, I have stacked horizontally all my to be read piles. I think there's about 4 or 5 piles of 60 books, something like that, there. So that's my system, such as it is. What book have you always meant to read and haven't gotten round to yet? Anything you feel embarrassed never to have read? Well, the answer to both of those previously would have been Ulysses by James Joyce, which I was embarrassed not having read, as it's a sort of the cream of modernism. And I sort of see myself on that wing of literature, I suppose, to some extent. But I actually started reading that as part of a group read in March. Unfortunately, we had to abandon it when lockdown first hit, because Ulysses takes some mental energy, and all of us were sort of in a state of flux with lockdown, and unfortunately the read got abandoned. But I will be finishing Ulysses next year, so I won't have that embarrassment hanging over me. And as to the fact that I've barely read any other books from the Victorian canon, I'm not embarrassed in the slightest. I've never read Dickens, I've never read Hardy, I've read one Jane Austen. These books don't, on the small sample of the books I've read, they don't speak to me. My degree is in history, so I'm not, the historical element of the Victorian period sort of coming through these books is of no interest to me, because I've studied it from a history point of view. And the situations and relationships and that just... I'd rather read modern versions of them, to be honest. So I'm not embarrassed in the slightest. 7. Disappointing, overrated, just not good. What book did you feel you were supposed to like but didn't? Well, how many books do you want for this? So Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchior is made the shortlist of the Booker International, is my worst book of the year. I don't have a best book of the year, but I certainly have a worst book of the year, and that is it. That was a real BookTube darling. Although I said before, of all the books that I've reviewed on Goodreads, that has had the review of that book has had the most likes. So there are people who agree with me, but I guess they just don't have BookTube channels. And the actual winner of that prize, The Discomfort of Evening, I didn't like, but a lot of other people didn't like it as well. So I can't say I was meant to like it, although a prize judging panel suggested that I was meant to like it, but I humbly disagree with them. And the final book here is Utopia Avenue, the new David Mitchell book, which I hated. It's about a rock and roll band. On 70% of it, or 3 out of the 4 band members, as each get their own chapters. You'd have to describe it as sort of, fairly straight realism in terms of the style. But the other character and the other 25% of the book is this nonsense world that he brought from Bone Clocks, his previous novel, and has introduced into here and jars achingly against the sort of realism of the rest of the book, completely undermines it. And I have a feeling that Mitchell's always going to do this in all his subsequent books, because he's so in love with this world of Bone Clocks that he's created. And even though I've read every single Mitchell book up till now, no more. I'm done with him. 8. What kind of stories are you drawn to? Well, I'm not drawn by story. I mean, there's only 7 stories to go round, and what gives the variety of literature is the approach to those stories in character, relationships, setting, style, language. That's the interesting thing, not the story. So when I pick up a book and read the blurb, I'm not interested in the story. I'm looking for the ideas suggested in the blurb, either of the theme of the book or the character, something quite interesting about the character, or the form of the book. That there might be sort of stylistic inventiveness. I'm looking for what I think has gone into that book in terms of ideas and creativity. It is not story. Are there any stories you steer clear of? Yes. Myth retellings or updating of myths. I mean, I'm hostile to myth anyway, being sort of absolutely entrenched in the modern contemporary world. But therefore, to update myths and bring them into the contemporary world seems to be an absolute, wasted endeavour. I understand, you might want to reclaim a myth, particularly from a feminist perspective or a post-colonial perspective. I get it. But, I'd rather just dismiss the myth personally rather than reclaim it. And the other is magical realism. 9. If you could require the President to read one book, what would it be? Okay, so I checked with Courtney on this, if it was within the parameters to change from a US President to the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and she said, yeah, that seems to be within the spirit of the thing. So then I thought very hard about, well, what would I recommend to Boris Johnson? And I don't know if this book exists, but there should be a collection of all his writings for the Daily Telegraph newspaper from the 1980s about Europe, in which he made up these stories about such as Caribbean bananas couldn't be imported because they were too bendy or curved against EU regulations. This sort of complete fake news, misinformation that laid the seeds of the whole Brexit thing, 40 years ago or 35 years ago. And Boris Johnson was front and central of that. Now, I don't know whether he genuinely was anti-Europe himself, or he was just following his paymasters, the owners and editors of his newspaper. But I would like, if that book existed, for him to reread it and to see if he still felt all of this was true and justifiable. But on the assumption that book doesn't exist, I'd actually like him to read my debut novel called A.B.&.E. from 2009, because Boris Johnson doesn't have an ideological bone in him. He stands for nothing. He believes in nothing other than Boris Johnson. He's a cheerleader. He shakes his pom-poms to rouse the spirit of the nation, in this case in a patriotic, nationalist, anti-foreigner way of Brexit. And the reason I say he should read my book is because in order for him to sort of wave the Union Jack, he appeals to this bygone age of Britain that probably never existed, of the village green, ducks on the pond, cricket on the green, the drink, the bitter beer drunk on the table outside the local pub, etc., etc., etc. Now, that Britain never existed, but it's a persistent myth that is offered. It's a vision that's offered for us to return to. But if you read my book A.B.&.E., you'd see an alternative version of Britain that was, I think, more up to date. That book is set on a Club 1830 holiday resort in Kavos, which is on the island of Corfu in Greece, in which classical Greek culture is absolutely stomped into dust by the marauding British youth, bringing all their cultural ways with them and imposing it on top of the sort of native Greeks, of rampant drunkenness, drug use, and sex on the beach and everywhere. And whether Boris would find that eye-opening or not, I don't know, but it's certainly a truer vision of what 21st century Britain is, pre-COVID obviously, than whatever mythical vision he has. And finally, what do you plan to read next? So I've talked about the books I'm currently reading. We're 7 days away from the end of the year. There may be a couple of books I'll fit in there before, but I'm going to talk about my first two reads of 2021 because they are definite. The first is Mrs. Dunaway by Virginia Woolf. Now, I've never read any Virginia Woolf. Because the January the 1st is a traditional buddy read between me and Jason over at Old Blues Chapter and Verse. And this year, this is the chosen book. And the other book I'm reading in January is Dennis Johnson, Tree of Smoke, 610 pages. Because for me, 2021 is the book of not just March of the Mammoths, but 10 months of the year of Mammoths. I've got 10 books, of which this is probably the shortest, at 610 pages, that I'm going to read during the course of the year. And I don't know what order I'm going to read them in, but it seemed sensible for me to start off with this one, A, because it's the shortest, but also it's Dennis Johnson, who is not so intimidating and difficult in his style, unlike, I've got some on the list like The Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, I've got The Recognition by William Gaddis, I've got The Tunnel by William Gass. You know, they're quite difficult, dense books. So I think this is a way to ease me into it, because it's a real challenge I've set myself, because I do struggle with big books, because I have a sort of a yearning to read other books in parallel that I can complete and, you know, have a complete concept of, whereas a book that's going to take a month to read on its own that excludes other reads is going to be, you know, I've struggled with that. So, you know, I hope this is going to ease me into it. And Ulysses is one of the books on the list. So there you have it. That was the NY New York Times by the book tag. Thanks again to Courtney, and till next time.